When Daniel and Marissa Hensley first stepped inside the townhouse on East 63rd Street, they were struck by the quiet. It wasn't the usual city stillness, the muffled hum of traffic, and the occasional dog bark, but a deeper kind. The kind you feel in the back of your neck. The real estate listing had played up its history, once the home of legendary actor Yul Brynner. To Marissa, that was a charming bonus. To Daniel, it was just trivia. They bought it in late spring. The building was elegant but narrow, its brick facade weathered in a way that felt dignified, almost aristocratic. Inside, there were touches of another era carved moldings, heavy wood doors, the kind of fireplace you didn't see in modern builds. In the den, a wall still carried a faint square outline where a painting had once hung. The first few weeks passed without incident, though Marissa admitted she sometimes felt watched in the upstairs study. It was a long, high-ceilinged room, lined with built-in bookshelves. She worked from home and often left the door open, but occasionally, she'd close it after catching herself glancing at the corner near the window, the one that faced the street. One night in June, Daniel woke to a faint smell of cigarette smoke. It was odd because neither of them smoked, and the windows were closed. He got up, thinking maybe it was drifting in from a neighbor, but the scent seemed stronger in the hallway. When he reached the study, the air was dense with it, a rich, almost sweet tobacco, the kind you'd associate with a cigar lounge. He searched every inch of the room. Nothing. No smoke. No source. By morning, the smell was gone. Marissa started noticing other things. A chair in the dining room slightly angled away from the table. A glass left on the counter that she swore she had put in the dishwasher. Soft, deliberate footsteps in the upstairs hallway while she was alone. The turning point came in late July. She had stayed up working past midnight and decided to make tea. As she walked down the staircase, she caught a glimpse of a figure reflected in the glass of a picture frame, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark, open-collared shirt. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. The reflection was gone. When she told Daniel, he tried to be rational. Old houses make noises. Reflections play tricks. But the following week, he heard it himself, a man's voice, low and measured, speaking a language he didn't recognize. It came from the study, and it lasted no more than 5 seconds. When he entered, the room was empty, but the faint smell of tobacco hung in the air again. Later, while researching the property, Marissa learned that Brynner had been known for his deep, distinctive voice and for smoking heavily, often during quiet moments in that very study. She also found a black-and-white photograph of him, taken in the house, standing in front of the same window where she always felt watched. The Hensleys have not moved out. They say the presence isn't threatening, though it's undeniably there. They keep the study just as it was when they moved, in shelves untouched, curtains drawn halfway. And sometimes, on late nights, Daniel will pause in the hallway, catching that same faint smell, and murmur into the still air, "Good night, Yul." The summer heat in Manhattan lingered longer than usual that year, and the Hensleys found themselves keeping the windows open at night just to let the air move. The townhouse had a way of holding temperature, like it clung to every season longer than it should. In the mornings, sunlight filtered in through the tall front windows, catching the dust in thin golden shafts. But by late afternoon, the interior began to feel enclosed, shadowed, as if the house preferred dimness. Marissa had begun spending more time in the study, despite her unease. She told herself it was simply the quietest room in the house, the one place where the outside noise didn't intrude. The shelves were still lined with a few stray books left by previous owners, most of them in languages she couldn't read: French, Russian, a couple of leather-bound volumes with faded Cyrillic lettering. She'd sometimes trace the spines with her fingertips, wondering which ones had belonged to Brynner himself. The air in there was always a degree cooler than the rest of the house, and carried a faint undertone of something earthy, not unpleasant, but old, like the scent of a well-kept theater wardrobe. Daniel kept his distance from the study, though he never said why outright. He had begun to notice that whenever he passed its open doorway, he felt compelled to glance inside, even if just for a second. It was never anything dramatic, no shapes moving, no shadows darting, but rather the impression that the room was not entirely empty. Sometimes, in that half-second glance, he'd be almost certain someone had been standing near the window a moment before. The nights were when the house felt different. The tobacco scent returned sporadically, always at times when the air was still and the world outside was quiet. It wasn't the acrid bite of modern cigarettes, but the deeper, smoother aroma of hand-rolled ones. On one of these nights, Marissa woke just after 3 a.m., feeling the unmistakable weight of someone's presence in the bedroom. She turned over slowly, heart beating too fast, and saw Daniel asleep beside her. The corner of the room was just a darker patch of shadow, unbroken, but she could have absolutely sworn that she heard the faintest exhale of breath from that direction, steady and deliberate, as if someone had been there all along, watching. A few days later, she decided to open the large wardrobe in the study, an antique piece that had been left behind when they bought the house. It was empty except for a single, worn black shirt hanging on a wooden hanger. She touched it, and the faint smell of smoke seemed to lift from the fabric itself. She left it there, closing the wardrobe softly, as though not wanting to disturb whoever had last worn it. By August, small sounds began to appear in their daily life, a rhythmic tapping in the early morning hours that seemed to come from the upstairs landing, the muffled creak of footsteps that paused right outside their bedroom door, the occasional rattle of the doorknob to the study. Daniel once caught sight of the knob turning slowly on its own, but the door didn't open. He stood there for nearly a minute, frozen, until the movement stopped. When he finally pushed the door open, the room felt oppressively still, as though it had been holding its breath. Neither of them spoke much about these things to anyone else. Friends came over for dinner and commented on how quiet the house felt for the middle of Manhattan. A neighbor, an older woman who had lived on the street for decades, mentioned in passing that Brynner had been very private in his last years there. She didn't elaborate, and when Daniel gently pressed for more, she only gave a polite smile and changed the subject. One late evening, Marissa lingered alone in the study. Outside, the city was hushed under a light summer rain. She sat in the old leather chair by the window, laptop open but untouched, her gaze fixed on the reflection in the glass. The faint outline of a man's face seemed to be there, not clearly, but in the way fog on a mirror hints at shapes. She didn't turn around. She didn't want to break whatever fragile stillness had settled in the room. And somewhere in the house, whether in the next room or much closer, there came the low murmur of a man's voice, steady, almost conversational, but in a language she didn't understand. The words blurred into the patter of the rain, and the smell of tobacco drifted back into the air, heavier than before. Marissa closed her laptop without looking away from the glass. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The rain that night gave way to a heavy, pressing humidity by morning, the kind that seemed to weigh down even the sound of passing cars on East 63rd Street. Inside, the townhouse felt unusually still, as though the walls themselves were listening. Marissa woke first and padded quietly through the hallway, the cool wood floorboards creaking in the familiar way they always had, except today. The sound seemed delayed, like each creak was answered by another one a fraction of a second later, just behind her, as though an invisible set of footsteps followed her exact path. She didn't mention it to Daniel over breakfast. He had been sleeping poorly, though he wouldn't admit it. The shadows under his eyes had deepened, and twice in the last week she had found him standing in the upstairs hall after midnight, motionless, listening to something only he could hear. The study had begun to feel less like a room and more like a threshold, a place where, once you entered, the rest of the house fell away. The air inside carried a strange weight now, denser than the rest of the townhouse, as if the atmosphere had thickened with the accumulation of unspoken things. The tobacco scent had become almost constant there, faint in the daytime but sharper at night. The shirt in the wardrobe remained untouched, though Marissa sometimes thought it hung slightly differently, as if someone had taken it out and replaced it without her knowing. On a Sunday afternoon in early September, Daniel decided to finally sort through the narrow storage closet off the study. It had been crammed with odds and ends left by the previous owner's old curtain rods, a box of mismatched light bulbs, yellowing newspapers. At the very back, beneath a loose floorboard, he found a shallow compartment. Inside lay a single object, a silver cigarette case, tarnished but still gleaming faintly in the dim light. Its surface was engraved with a small, intricate emblem, a pair of stylized initials YB. He brought it to Marissa, who turned it over in her hands. The latch clicked open with surprising ease, revealing 3 hand-rolled cigarettes, perfectly preserved, as if they had been placed there yesterday. No dust, no brittle paper, just the faintest, intoxicating aroma that instantly filled the room. It was the exact same scent that had been haunting them for weeks. That night, Daniel left the case on the mantel in the study. They both avoided speaking about it, but when Marissa entered the room the next morning, the lid was closed again, even though she clearly remembered leaving it open. The position of the case had shifted slightly, as though it had been turned toward the chair by the window. Over the next few days, the disturbances grew subtly bolder. Drawers left ajar would be found closed. The soft clicking of a lighter, a sound neither of them had heard in years, began to punctuate the late evenings. And always, that voice, low and steady, speaking words they couldn't decipher, drifting through the air like a private conversation they were never meant to hear. One evening, Marissa stayed late in the study, working by the glow of a single desk lamp. The city outside was quiet, only the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement breaking the stillness. She sensed, before she saw, that the air in the corner near the wardrobe had grown heavier, as though a human form occupied it. Her breath slowed without her meaning to, and in the glass of the window she caught it again, that unmistakable outline of a man's head and shoulders, sharper now than ever before. She didn't move, didn't speak. The reflection shifted slightly, as though turning to look directly at her. And then, in a voice so close it seemed to come from just behind her chair, came a single, quiet sentence, not in English, not in any language she could place, but spoken with a calm, deliberate cadence, each syllable drawn out, as though the speaker wanted her to remember them. The lamp flickered once. When it steadied, the reflection was gone. But the smell of smoke lingered, thick and warm, curling in the air like a presence that had no intention of leaving. The days that followed moved with an unsteady rhythm, as though the townhouse itself had slipped slightly out of sync with the city around it. Outside, autumn had begun to creep into Manhattan. Colder mornings, the sound of wind rattling through the street's narrow canyon of brick facades. Inside, the air in the house felt thicker, slower, as though it clung to them a moment longer than it should whenever they walked through it. Daniel had started avoiding certain routes through the house without consciously realizing it. He no longer cut through the study to get to the back staircase. Instead, he took the longer path through the dining room. Marissa noticed, though she didn't call him out on it, partly because she'd been doing something similar. In her case, it was the wardrobe. She hadn't opened it again since the night she'd touched the black shirt, but she found herself glancing at it each time she passed, half expecting to see the door ajar. The cigarette case remained on the mantel in the study, though Daniel swore he'd once found it in the center of the desk without having moved it himself. Marissa tried to dismiss it as a slip in memory, but the quiet certainty in his voice unsettled her. They'd agreed, without ever formally deciding, not to touch the case or the cigarettes inside again. One night, a little past midnight, Daniel was standing in the kitchen rinsing a glass when he heard the faint, deliberate click of the study door closing. He froze, his wet hands hovering over the sink. The sound was too precise to be a draft or settling wood. The old townhouse had a way of amplifying certain noises, and he could picture it perfectly. The heavy door easing shut, the latch catching softly. He walked slowly toward the front of the house, the air cooling as he moved up the hallway. The door to the study was closed, the faintest sliver of warm light spilling from beneath it. His first instinct was to call out to Marissa, but she was upstairs, asleep. He stood there, his hand hovering near the knob, listening. From inside came the faint scrape of a chair moving against the floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lighter being struck. Then, silence. He backed away without opening the door. The next morning, when Marissa entered the study, the scent of tobacco was heavier than usual, but there was something else now, something faint and metallic beneath it. On the desk lay a small brass cufflink, its surface worn smooth with age. She recognized it immediately from a photograph she'd seen online weeks earlier, one of Brynner in a crisp dark suit, the glint of the cufflinks catching in the stage lights. By mid-October, the disturbances were no longer confined to the study. Daniel began hearing footsteps on the back staircase in the early hours, slow, measured steps that descended halfway before stopping. Marissa caught fleeting glimpses in the reflection of the hallway mirror. Not full shapes, but the sense of movement, like someone stepping just out of sight. One evening, a friend visited for dinner. Halfway through the meal, she paused, her gaze drifting toward the hallway. "Do you guys have a tenant or something?" she asked. "I thought I saw a man walk past just now." Neither Daniel nor Marissa answered immediately. The friend laughed nervously and brushed it off. But after she left, the house seemed to settle into a deeper kind of quiet, a waiting quiet, as if aware it had been noticed by someone new. That night, Marissa woke to the sound of a low voice outside their bedroom door. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it carried that same deliberate tone she had heard once before, the cadence of someone speaking to an audience of one. She sat up, listening, her eyes fixed on the narrow band of shadow beneath the door. A single wisp of smoke curled across it, moving slowly, impossibly, against the still air. By late October, the townhouse no longer felt like a place they had moved into, it felt like a place they had been admitted to. The difference was subtle but constant, as though their presence was tolerated, not owned. There were moments when the air itself seemed to lean toward them, attentive in a way that made the skin prickle along their necks. The most noticeable change was the way the disturbances began to respond. At first, they had been random, a faint smell here, an unexplained sound there, but now, the timing was too precise to be coincidence. If Daniel spoke aloud about the study while they were in the kitchen, within minutes they would hear the faint rattle of the study's doorknob. If Marissa just thought about the wardrobe, she would find it standing open the next morning. The cigarette case became the center of these moments. It never moved when they were in the room, but they began to suspect it shifted positions when left alone, as if it were being angled deliberately toward them. Once, Daniel found it resting directly atop a folded sheet of paper on the desk. The paper was blank, but smelled strongly of tobacco and something else he couldn't name, faintly sweet, faintly bitter, like an old theater dressing room. The voice began answering them, though never in English. One evening, Daniel sat in the study as the smell of smoke drifted in. Without looking up from the book in his lap, he said quietly, "We know you're here." There was a long pause, and then, in the far corner near the wardrobe, a single line was spoken in that same deep, measured tone. The syllables were slow, deliberate, like a stage actor emphasizing every word for the back row. He didn't understand it, but the cadence made the hairs on his arms stand upright. That night, Marissa dreamed she was sitting in the same leather chair by the window, the cigarette case on the desk before her. In the dream, the lid was open, and one of the cigarettes had been lit, smoke curling upward in perfect, unbroken spirals. When she woke, her pillow smelled faintly of tobacco, though the bedroom door had been closed all night. They stopped inviting people over, not because they feared judgment, but because the house seemed to change when outsiders came, quieter, almost withdrawn, only to surge with activity again after they left. Twice, after visitors had gone, they found small objects in new places. A matchbook on the kitchen counter with a logo from a long-closed New York nightclub. A single theater ticket stub dated decades before they'd bought the house. It was early November when the most direct interaction happened. Marissa was alone in the study late one evening, the city beyond the window blurred with a cold drizzle. She sat at the desk, flipping idly through one of the old books from the shelf, French text, yellowed pages. She turned a page and froze. Tucked between two chapters was a small black and white photograph. It showed a man in his 40s, bald, with that unmistakable angular jaw, seated in what was clearly the same study. He was leaning back in the leather chair, cigarette in hand, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth as though aware the camera had caught him mid-thought. The photo wasn't printed on glossy paper but on something heavier, almost like a theater program. She studied it for a long moment before setting it down on the desk. The room was utterly still. Then, faintly, from the direction of the wardrobe, came the soft sound of someone inhaling slow, deep, and close. Marissa turned her head, but nothing moved in the dim light. The photograph remained where she had placed it, but the cigarette case, which had been closed moments before, now sat open, the lid angled toward her as though in invitation. By December, the quiet tension in the townhouse had reached a breaking point. The responses from the unseen presence were no longer subtle. Footsteps would follow them from room to room. Doors would open as they approached, and the cigarette case was almost never where they had last left it. One cold evening, they decided to end it. Daniel took the case from the mantel and carried it to the fireplace in the study. He hesitated, looking at Marissa, then at the open wardrobe. For a long moment, neither of them moved. From behind them came that deep, unmistakable voice, louder now, resonant, a single sentence spoken with the clarity of someone standing only a few feet away. The smell of smoke swelled until it seemed to fill their lungs. The flames in the fireplace flared on their own, high and bright, though neither of them had lit them. The cigarette case slipped from Daniel's fingers, landing on the hearth with a metallic ring. When the fire died moments later, the case was gone. The house fell utterly still. The smell of smoke faded. From that night on, the study remained just a room again. But Daniel and Marissa never opened the wardrobe, and they never spoke of the moment when Yul Brynner's presence had finally, or perhaps only temporarily, stepped back into the shadows. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.